The day my father-in-law destroyed our mortgage approval, he was smiling. He was sitting at the head of his dining room table, cutting his pork roast into neat little squares, and he was smiling. I didn't know what he'd done yet, but I would find out, and when I did, I made sure he regretted every single square. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the dramatic part, the quiet part, because that's where it actually started. My wife Clara and I had been married for 3 years when we decided it was time. Time to stop renting the apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like someone else's laundry detergent. Time to stop parking on the street and hoping the car was still there in the morning. Time to build something that was ours. We had saved carefully. 2 incomes, no vacations for 18 months, a spreadsheet that I updated every Sunday morning with a coffee in my hand, and a feeling in my chest that was equal parts hope and anxiety. We had enough for a down payment. Not a huge one, but enough. We had a pre-approval letter from our bank. We had found a house in a neighborhood called Linden Creek, about 40 minutes from the city, 45 minutes from Clara's parents' place. It was a corner lot. It had a backyard with a fence that needed painting, a kitchen with slightly outdated tile, and a garage that smelled like motor oil and sawdust. I loved it immediately. Clara loved it too. She stood in the kitchen on the day we first saw it and turned in a slow circle, looking at the windows and the light coming through them, and she said, "This is where I want to make breakfast." That was all I needed to hear. We put in an offer. It was accepted. We were 2 weeks from closing. That was when the phone calls started. Harold, my father-in-law, had opinions about everything. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the frequency and the urgency of the calls in those 2 weeks. He called Clara 3 times in one day. He called me once, which was rare. Harold and I had what I would describe as a transactional relationship. He was polite to me at family events. He complimented my handshake. He occasionally asked about my work in a way that suggested he had already decided my answers would be inadequate. We were not enemies. We were not friends. We were 2 men who loved the same woman and had agreed, wordlessly, to maintain a careful distance. But now he was calling. The first call I took from him was short. He said he had heard about the house. He said Linden Creek was a long drive. He said the school district was average. I told him we didn't have children yet. He said, "Yet exactly." He said the neighborhood was changing, which was the kind of comment I chose not to engage with. He said he knew a real estate contact who could find us something closer, something with better value. I thanked him and said we were happy with our choice. He said, "We'll see." I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say, but I was in the middle of a mortgage process and coordinating with an inspector and reviewing closing disclosures, so I filed it away and moved on. 2 days later, our loan officer called. Her name was Patricia. She had been calm and professional through the entire process, the kind of woman who explains things twice without making you feel stupid. When she called this time, she did not sound calm. She sounded careful. She said there had been an inquiry on my file from a third-party financial institution that she didn't recognize. She said it had flagged a review. She said the underwriting department was asking questions about a business loan I apparently had taken out 6 years ago. I had never taken out a business loan 6 years ago. I told her that. She said she understood. She said these things sometimes happened with identity mix-ups or credit bureau errors. She said it would take a few days to resolve. She said it might push our closing date. I hung up and sat very still at my desk for about 90 seconds. Then I called my bank directly and asked them to pull everything on my credit file. The business loan inquiry was traced back to a financial services company I had never heard of. It was a small company. It had a website with 3 pages and a phone number that rang twice before going to voicemail. The loan itself didn't exist. What existed was the inquiry, which had been enough to trigger a flag in the underwriting system and slow everything down. Patricia told me these things could sometimes happen when someone with access to personal information made a formal inquiry on your behalf without your knowledge. She phrased it very carefully. She said, "Sometimes a well-meaning family member will reach out to an affiliated lender to compare rates, and it creates a paper trail that looks different than it actually is." She was being diplomatic. I was not feeling diplomatic. I said, "Patricia, are you telling me someone ran a credit inquiry on my file without my permission?" She said, "I'm telling you that the inquiry exists and that it came from an institution that is sometimes used by referral networks connected to independent mortgage brokers." I said, "Can you tell me when it was submitted?" She gave me the date. It was 4 days after Harold had told me he knew a real estate contact. I wrote that date down on a yellow sticky note. I pressed the pen hard. I stuck it to the inside of my desk drawer and closed it. I did not tell Clara yet. I want to be honest about that because I've thought about it many times since. I didn't tell her because I wasn't certain. I had a timeline and a suspicion and a very uncomfortable feeling in my stomach, and I knew that if I said her father's name out loud in connection with this, it would either destroy our relationship or destroy my marriage, depending on whether I was right or wrong. I needed to be right before I opened that door, so I kept moving. I kept going to work. I kept responding to Patricia's emails. I kept reviewing the closing documents that were now on hold, and I started paying attention in a different way. I started reading Harold. I had always noticed he was controlling. Clara had grown up with it. She called it his way of showing love, which is something people say when they've been told for so long that control is care that they've stopped questioning the difference. Harold managed everything in that family. He had chosen the neighborhood they lived in, the church they attended, the contractors who worked on the house, the financial advisor who handled the family's modest portfolio. He had opinions on where Clara should apply to college, what she should study, who she should date. He had not liked me at first, I knew that. I was from a different city. My family was smaller, quieter, less connected to Harold's network of opinions and influence. But I had stayed, and Clara had chosen me, and Harold had eventually accepted this with the grace of a man who had lost a vote he expected to win. But here we were, 3 years into a marriage, buying a house 45 minutes away, and Harold was making phone calls. The first real confirmation came from a corporate registry search I ran on my laptop at 11:30 on a Thursday night. The financial services company that had submitted the inquiry was called Meridian Capital Advisory. It had been incorporated 4 years earlier by a man named Dale Forsyth. A LinkedIn search showed that Dale Forsyth had worked for 12 years at a mortgage brokerage owned by Harold's oldest friend, a man named Robert Chambers. 3 connections in a chain: Harold, Robert Chambers, Dale Forsyth, Meridian Capital Advisory, my credit file, circumstantial. But I kept going, a week before the Sunday dinner. I'll tell you about shortly, Harold had asked me to come over on a weekday to help him move boxes from a storage shelf in his garage. It was a favor. I came because I was still maintaining the careful distance. While we were in the garage, his phone rang. He stepped outside to take the call. The garage door was half open. I could hear him clearly. He said, "Dale, I told you, just make sure it stays in review long enough. They'll miss the window and the seller will walk. Then they'll have to start over. And when they start over, they'll be closer to me this time." There was a pause. He said, "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm protecting my daughter." Another pause. He said, "Nobody's going to find out." I had my phone in my back pocket. I had been recording a voice memo to remind myself to pick up a specific type of screw for a shelf I was building. The memo was still running. I stood very still between 2 shelves of paint cans and garden tools and let it run. That was the second revelation. The inquiry was the first. The corporate chain was the second. The recording in the garage was the third. And what came next was where all 3 came together. The Sunday dinner happened 12 days before what was supposed to be our closing date. Harold and his wife, Diane, hosted every Sunday. It was not optional. Claire had explained this to me early in our relationship in a tone that suggested she was describing a law of physics. You showed up on Sunday. You ate what Diane cooked. You sat at the table Harold presided over. You were grateful. I showed up that Sunday with a folder in my bag, not visibly. The bag was under my coat on the hook by the door, but the folder was there. I had spent the previous 3 days pulling together everything I could find. Bank inquiry records, the timeline of Harold's calls, the corporate registry printout showing Dale Forsyth as a director of Meridian Capital Advisory, a printed transcript of the garage recording, word for word, and a written summary from Patricia documenting the inquiry's effect on the underwriting review, which I had formally requested in writing. Harold had made a point of asking about the house early, before we even sat down. He asked with the face of a man who already knows the answer. He said, "I heard you hit some delays with the financing." "These things happen. Market's tricky right now." He shook his head with practiced sympathy. I said, "We're working through it." He nodded. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly. He said, "If you need any guidance, you know I'm here." I said, "I appreciate that." We sat down. Diane brought out the roast. Harold poured the wine. Clara's brother Marcus was there with his wife Petra. Their 2 kids were at the small table in the corner. Everything was exactly as it always was, which was the point. Harold's world ran on the comfort of sameness, of people in their assigned seats, of himself at the head. About halfway through the meal, Harold set down his fork and looked around the table with the expression of a man preparing to deliver wisdom. He did this sometimes. He called it sharing perspective. Everyone else called it his sermon. He said, "You know what I think the problem is with young people today? No one answered because no one was supposed to. The question was rhetorical. He said, they want independence before they've earned the wisdom to use it. They want to run before they can walk. They want to be 40 miles away from everyone who loves them because they think that's what freedom looks like. He looked at Clara when he said 40 miles, not at me. But what they actually need is guidance, roots, people around them who know what they're doing. Freedom without structure isn't freedom. It's just loneliness with a mortgage. He picked up his fork. Marcus made a small sound of agreement. Petra looked at her plate. Clara said, "Dad?" He said, "I'm just saying." I said nothing. I was cutting my roast into small, careful pieces. I was thinking about the folder in my bag by the door. The closing date came and went. The seller, as Harold had predicted to Dale Forsyth, did not wait. They accepted another offer. Patricia called me with the news in a voice that was genuinely apologetic. She said we could start the process again, that our pre-approval was still valid, that this happens sometimes. I said, "I know. Thank you, Patricia." Clara cried that night. Not loudly, just sitting on the couch with her knees pulled up, looking at the photos she had taken on her phone of the Linden Creek house, the kitchen with the light coming through the windows, the backyard fence that needed painting. I sat next to her. I didn't say anything about Harold, not yet. I held her hand and I thought about the folder. 2 weeks after the deal fell through, Harold organized what he called a family gathering to regroup and support Clara and Daniel through this disappointment. Those were the exact words in the group text he sent. Clara and Daniel through this disappointment, as if we were children who had failed a test and needed to be consoled by the principal. The gathering was at his house. Of course it was. It was a Saturday evening. Marcus and Petra were coming. Diane had made food. Harold had selected wine. I had been preparing for 3 weeks. I had gone back to Patricia and asked her, formally and in writing, to document the timeline of the credit inquiry and its effect on the underwriting review. She sent me a detailed email. I printed it. I had contacted Meridian Capital Advisory directly, posing as a potential client, and asked about their referral network. The person on the phone mentioned several mortgage brokers by name. One of them was affiliated with Dale Forsyth's former employer. I recorded that call on my phone, the call recording app I had downloaded specifically for this purpose. I had the original voice recording from the garage. I had transferred it to my laptop, cleaned up the audio slightly with a free tool online, and saved it in 3 different places. I had a conversation with a lawyer friend named Sam, who I had gone to college with and who now practiced civil law. I described the situation to Sam without using Harold's name. Sam told me that what I was describing, a deliberate interference with a financial transaction through the unauthorized submission of a credit inquiry, could constitute tortious interference depending on the jurisdiction. He said if there was a recording of someone explicitly stating the intent to cause a deal to fall through, that was significant. He said, whoever did this should probably know that before they do anything else. I thanked Sam. I did not tell him who had done it yet. I drove to Harold's house on Saturday evening with the folder in a leather document case. Clara was in the passenger seat. She was talking about whether we should look at a different neighborhood this time. Something closer to her gym, maybe? I listened. I said yes. I said maybe, and that sounds good. I was driving with both hands on the wheel, and I was very, very calm. The evening started normally. Diane had made pasta. Harold opened the wine with ceremony. Marcus and Petra arrived a few minutes after us. The kids were not there this time. It was an adult evening, which meant the table would be quieter and the words would carry further. Harold gave a small toast to resilience. He said these setbacks were part of life. He said the right house would come. He said, and this was the moment I had been waiting for without knowing exactly when it would arrive. Sometimes things fall apart because they were never quite right to begin with, and sometimes that's a blessing in disguise. Sometimes someone who loves you is looking out for you, even when you can't see it. He looked at Clara when he said it. He was still smiling. Clara said, "What does that mean, Dad?" He said, "It means family looks out for family." I set down my fork. I said, "Harold, I want to ask you something directly." The table went quiet. Not dramatically, just that specific kind of quiet that happens when a room understands that something real is about to be said. Harold looked at me with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being addressed directly in his own dining room. He said, "Of course." I said, "Did you contact a financial services company called Meridian Capital Advisory in connection with our mortgage application?" A small thing happened to his face. It was brief, a tightening around the eyes, a half-second recalibration. Then the smile came back, slightly adjusted. He said, "I don't know what you're referring to." I said, The company was incorporated by Dale Forsyth. You've known Dale for about 20 years through Robert Chambers, who runs a mortgage brokerage in the city. An inquiry was submitted to our lender from Meridian Capital Advisory 4 days after you told me you knew a real estate contact who could help us find something closer to home. The smile was gone. Diane said, Harold? Marcus was very still. Harold said, Daniel, I don't know where you're getting this information, but I think you're confusing things. I was trying to help. I reached into the leather document case and took out the folder. I set it on the table next to my plate. I said, Patricia Chen, our loan officer, documented the timeline of the inquiry and its effect on our underwriting review in writing. I have that document here. I placed it on the table face up. I also have the corporate registry showing Dale Forsyth as a director of Meridian Capital Advisory. I placed that next to it. And I have a call I made to Meridian Capital Advisory as a prospective client, during which a staff member named the referral network that connects to Dale Forsyth's former employer. Harold said, This is speculation. You're building a case out of coincidences. I said, You're right that those 3 things alone are circumstantial. I reached into the folder and took out a single printed transcript. I had transcribed the garage recording myself, word for word. I said, 3 weeks ago, I was in your garage helping you move boxes. Your phone rang and you stepped outside. The garage door was half open. I had a voice memo recording running on my phone. I have a recording of you telling Dale Forsyth, and I'm quoting directly here, just make sure it stays in review long enough. They'll miss the window and the seller will walk. Then they'll have to start over. And when they start over, they'll be closer to me this time. I slid the transcript across the table. No one at that table made a sound. Harold looked at the transcript. He looked at it for a long time. His face had gone through several phases in the last 30 seconds and had arrived at something I had not seen on it before. It was not anger. It was not denial exactly. It was the specific expression of a man who has been operating for decades on the assumption that he is the smartest person in any room he enters, and who has just discovered that this assumption was incorrect. Clara said, Dad. Not as a question, not as a plea, just his name, with a weight behind it that I think surprised both of them. Harold said, Clara, I was protecting you. That house was too far. That neighborhood was not right. I have more experience than you do with these decisions, and I was trying to save you from a mistake. Clara said, You sabotaged our mortgage. He said, I intervened. There's a difference. She said, No, there isn't. Diane reached across and put her hand on Harold's arm. He pulled it away, not aggressively, just reflexively, the way a man pulls away from comfort when he hasn't decided yet whether he deserves it. Marcus said, Dad, did you actually do this? Harold said, I did what I thought was right for this family. I said, I want to be clear about a few things. I have spoken with a lawyer. What was done here potentially constitutes tortious interference with a financial transaction. I am not currently planning to pursue legal action, but I want you to understand that the documentation I have is complete and it is preserved in multiple locations. I paused. I'm not saying this to threaten you. I'm saying it so that we're all operating with the same information. Harold said, You're threatening me in my own house. I said, I'm having a conversation. You're the one who had private conversations about my financial future without my knowledge. He had no answer for that. What happened after that was not a single dramatic scene. Real consequences rarely are. Harold tried, in the days that followed, to reframe the evening. He called Marcus and told him I had ambushed him. He told Diane I had been recording him illegally, which was not accurate in our jurisdiction. He called Clara 3 times in one day, which was something he had done before, but this time, Clara let 2 of the calls go to voicemail. That was new. Clara and I had a long conversation that same night, sitting on the floor of our apartment because neither of us wanted to sit on the couch, which was somehow too normal for what we were talking about. She asked me why I hadn't told her sooner. I told her honestly. I was afraid of being wrong. I was afraid that if I said her father's name and I was wrong, it would cost me something I couldn't get back. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, And if you had been wrong? I said, I would have owed him an apology and I would have given it. She nodded. She said, He's been doing this my whole life. Not always this directly, but this. Arranging things so that the outcome he wanted was the only outcome available. She said it without tears. She said it like someone reading a diagnosis they had suspected for years. That was the real cost of what Harold had done. Not the lost house, not the failed closing. The real cost was that his daughter finally named what he was. The Sunday dinners continued, but differently. Clara and I still attended because Clara was not ready to stop, and I respected that. But the dynamic had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. Harold no longer gave his sermons at the table, not the same way. He still had opinions, but he delivered them more quietly now, and when Clara or I didn't respond with agreement, he didn't press. The space he used to fill with authority was now just space. He also stopped calling me. Completely. For months, he did not call me once. I noticed this the way you notice when a background noise you've grown used to suddenly stops. Diane pulled me aside at a family birthday party about 6 weeks after the dinner and said in a low voice, "He knows he was wrong. He doesn't know how to say it. You understand?" I said I understood. I didn't say anything else. I thought about saying something kind, because Diane had always been decent to me, but I also thought about the fact that Diane had watched Harold manage and control and arrange for 30 years and had said nothing. And so I settled for a small nod and moved on. Marcus called me once. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "He's always been like this." I said, "I know that too." There wasn't much else to say. Harold's role in the family changed in small but permanent ways. He was no longer consulted on decisions the way he had been. Marcus and Petra stopped asking his opinion on their finances. Clara stopped sharing details about our plans before they were final. He was still there, still at the head of the table, still pouring the wine, but the table had changed around him. The people at it had changed. He was still the patriarch in the physical sense of the word. The authority was gone. I think that was, for Harold, worse than anything else I could have done. We started looking for houses again about 4 months later. This time, we didn't tell Harold. We didn't tell anyone in Claire's family until we were already under contract. We worked with a different loan officer, a man named Greg, who had been recommended by Patricia. We were meticulous. We checked every document. We monitored our credit file weekly. We used a different email address for all mortgage-related correspondence, one that was not connected to any account Harold had ever had access to. We found a house. It was not in Linden Creek. It was in a town called Harrow Falls, which was 63 miles from Harold and Diane's house. 63 miles. I did not choose it for the distance, but I did not choose against it because of the distance either. Harrow Falls had a small downtown with a hardware store and a coffee shop that roasted their own beans. It had a library with a garden in the back. It had a neighborhood called the Maple District, where the streets were named after trees, and the sidewalks were wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side without one of them stepping into the grass. The house was a 2-story with a blue door and a kitchen that had been recently renovated. The backyard had a fence. It did not need painting. We closed on a Tuesday in October. Greg called me when the final confirmation came through. I was sitting at my desk at work. I said thank you and hung up and sat for a moment looking at the yellow sticky note that was still in my desk drawer, the one with the date of Harold's credit inquiry written on it in pressed down pen. I took it out. I looked at it for a few seconds, then I folded it in half and put it in the recycling bin under my desk. I didn't need it anymore. We moved in on a Saturday in November. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes the air sharp and clean, and the trees in the Maple District had gone orange and red and were dropping leaves onto the sidewalk in slow, unhurried clusters. We rented a truck. Clara's friend Jess came to help. My brother drove 3 hours to be there. We carried boxes through the blue door and stacked them in rooms and argued cheerfully about where the couch should go. At one point, I was standing in the kitchen, alone for a moment, waiting for the kettle to boil. The afternoon light was coming through the window over the sink. It was the same kind of light Clara had stood in when we first saw the Linden Creek house. She had said, that day, that she wanted to make breakfast here. She hadn't been able to, but she would make breakfast in this kitchen, in this light. I heard her voice in the other room, laughing at something Jess had said. The kettle clicked off. I made 4 cups of coffee and carried them out on a tray and set them on the floor because we didn't have a table yet, and we all sat on the floor of our living room in our new house and drank coffee and talked about nothing important, which is the specific kind of conversation that only happens when people are somewhere they actually want to be. Harold and Diane visited once. In the spring, Clara invited them. I agreed to it because this was Clara's family and Clara's decision, and because I had said what I needed to say and done what I needed to do, and I was finished carrying the rest of it. Harold walked through the house quietly. He looked at the kitchen, he looked at the backyard, he looked at the fence that didn't need painting. He said very little. At one point, he stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and looked at Clara, who was at the counter slicing bread for lunch. and his face did something complicated that I chose not to analyze. Before they left, Harold shook my hand. It was a firm handshake, the same one he had always given me. He looked me in the eye and said, "Nice house." 2 words, that was all. I said, "Thank you." Diane hugged Clara for a long time by the blue door. Harold stood on the front step and looked at the street. He looked at the neighborhood. He looked at the 63 miles of distance between this house and his dining room table. Then he walked to his car and got in and drove away. Clara closed the blue door. She stood with her back against it for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, "I'm glad we're here." I said, "Me too." We were. We are. That's the whole story. That's all of it. We are 63 miles away from a man who tried to keep us dependent, and we are standing in our own kitchen, in our own light, making our own decisions, and nobody is managing us or arranging outcomes or smiling at a dinner table with information we don't have. We are just 2 people in a house with a blue door, and that is exactly enough.